Already in a dire situation, Lebanon is facing its worst ever humanitarian crisis. Israeli attacks have forced hundreds of thousands of people from their homes. So who will come to the rescue of those caught in the middle of the conflict? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. Israel's full-scale bombing campaign across Lebanon is into its second week and causing mass displacement. Prime Minister Najib Mikati says about 1 million people have left their homes in the south, the east and parts of the capital, Beirut. The country was already hosting 1.5 million Syrians, refugees who fled the war. Now, many of them have made the difficult decision to return home. Lebanese civilians, too, are risking the volatile situation in Syria rather than the waves of Israeli bombardment. At least 100,000 people have crossed the border in the past week. Even before the conflict escalated, Lebanon was marred in both the financial and political crisis, and nearly half the population was classified as food insecure, meaning they didn't have enough to eat. So how will Lebanon deal with so many displaced people? We'll discuss this just in a moment with our panel of guests, but first this report from Ferdia Carr.
With nowhere to turn, people fleeing the Israeli military's bombardment of southern Lebanon, the Bekaa Valley and parts of Beirut are crowding into car parks, onto beaches and wherever they can find refuge. The Lebanese government says nearly 120,000 people have been housed in temporary shelters, but with an estimated 1 million displaced, there isn't enough space for everyone.
1 million Lebanese people are moving from one place to another. This is the largest displacement to happen in the region, in Lebanon, and probably in history. And we saw within a few hours what's happened.
And with no end in sight to the Israeli attacks, there are fears of another protracted refugee exodus.
They had to escape the raids, the bombardments immediately, and some of them had just a few minutes. They are really scared and worried whether this crisis would last longer, whether it's few days, whether it's 1 month.
Lebanon already hosts an estimated 1.5 million Syrian refugees who've been fleeing the war there since 2011. Already uprooted once, now many have returned to Syria. Tens of thousands have crossed the border in recent days.
We were forced to leave Syria and came to Lebanon, where we were received with great hospitality. Now we're going back to my country, Syria. Lebanon is also our country, and we feel sad to leave. The Israelis have attacked and destroyed our second country, Lebanon. I cry because of the children who were killed by the Israelis.
This large-scale displacement is yet another crisis for Lebanon. The economy is on the verge of collapse, and the presidency has been vacant since 2022. Almost half the population didn't have access to enough food before this conflict. Now, the World Food Programme has launched an emergency appeal, saying it needs $100 million just to feed people until the end of this year. After the Israeli military killed Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah in a major attack in Beirut on Friday, hopes of de-escalation are fading. And as the bombing continues, it's people with the least who are paying the greatest price. Ferdia Carr, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, all of our guests today are joining us from the Lebanese capital, Beirut, and we have Dr. Ghassan Abu Sittah, who's worked as a war surgeon in Lebanon, Gaza, Syria and elsewhere in the Middle East. He's a professor of conflict medicine at the American University of Beirut. Maureen Philippon is the Lebanon country director of the Norwegian Refugee Council. And Arwa Damon is the founder of the International Network for Aid, Relief and Assistance and was previously a correspondent for CNN based in Lebanon. Welcome to all of you and thank you for joining us on Inside Story. Let me start with you, Arwa, because you know Lebanon very well. You've lived there in the past. I'm told you've just, in recent hours, landed back in Beirut. So it will be interesting to see what your impressions are, knowing Lebanon for so long and seeing it as it is now.
You know, James, I was talking to a couple of others about this, and they were also agreeing that it feels as if for the large part of it, given what Lebanon has been through over the last few years and this horrific bombing campaign that is taking place right now, the psychological toll on the population has pretty much paralyzed them in the traumatic freeze or flop mode. Everyone is under a severe degree of shock. Our own staff themselves at INADA, some of them have been displaced. Some of them have actually lost family members in the bombings that took place in the south. And they're kind of trying to hold it together to be able to keep going out there day in, day out, similar to the staff of, any number of organizations. There's not a single person here who has not somehow been impacted, who does not somehow either know someone who has been displaced or killed in this. And there really is this sort of struggle, not just to comprehend what it is that the country is going through, but it's that coupled with the uncertainty, and then also coupled with this growing, devastating, horrific need when it comes to people's humanitarian needs. And you can take that from, food to sanitation to diapers to clean underwear. Everything is needed at this stage.
Maureen, when you hear Arwa talking about how the people are suffering right now, it is, for me, very moving as someone who's spent a lot of time in Lebanon over the years and has seen such resilient people. This was a country that survived 15 years of civil war till 1990 and has had so many struggles since. How bad would you say things are right now?
I've been trying to put my head around this. It's basically like the entire city of London having to move out over 5 days. So it's incredible. People had to flee the violence with nothing from their clothes on their back. They didn't take their medication. They just grabbed their kids, put them at the back of the car. You needed 10 to 15 hours to do the 80 kilometers between the city of Tyre down south and Beirut on Monday evening. This is how scared the people have been to jump in the car with nothing and put you through 15 hours of traffic jam packed of the entire highway, moving only north. Still today, we have people sleeping in the park, sleeping in their cars, because there is no enough hosting capacity. It's 1 million people displaced as per the government figure. It's just incredible to host these people, to track these people, know where they are, try to meet their needs to the best we can. It is extremely challenging. Half of these people are children. So it's very complicated. And I would second what the colleague in Manera said. The psychological trauma is super heavy. The violence that we've seen over the last 5 days, or the last week actually, has been crazy.
Dr. Ghassan, you and Arwa actually have been in Gaza at various points during the last year. Let me ask you about comparisons, because Gaza has seen such an appalling time. Does it feel to you like Gaza is coming to Lebanon?
Absolutely, and I think one of the reason behind what Arwa was describing is that the Israeli genocide in Gaza is hanging over and is in the back of the minds of the Lebanese as they're watching this attack. Particularly, that Israel insisted in having a kind of almost performative atrocity, whether it's the premature babies, whether it's the attacks on the hospitals, where it's the attacks on the schools for the internally displaced. And so for the Lebanese, and for me also, so we start to see the same pattern, almost like the Gaza genocide has become a template for Israel's wars in the region. Yesterday, the Israelis bombed and flattened a building where internally displaced Lebanese were taking refuge in Sittah. Over the weekend, Bahman Hospital in Shayah in the southern suburb has had to evacuate. Over 41 Lebanese paramedics and doctors have been killed. When I was up in the south working in a hospital in Nabatiyah, we got word that further southward, an advanced trauma stabilization field hospital had been targeted with the murder of one of the doctors and 8 of the paramedics. And so we're seeing Israel's new war, this new 21st century concept of scorched earth, where you destroy hospitals, you destroy internally displaced camps, you corral people into one area, and then you attack. And that is playing on the minds of the Lebanese and of those of us who have seen this once before. Our intensive care unit here has children with the kind of blast injuries that I've seen in Gaza, of children with amputations that I've seen in Gaza. And it's like it's happening all over again.
Arwa, I mean, you heard Dr. Ghassan there say Gaza is being used as a template. Having been to both places, would you agree with that?
I mean, it's hard not to when you look at what is being targeted, but then when you also look at the size of the bombs that Israel is using to carry out this campaign. We're seeing massive, explosions happening. Those 2,000-pound bombs that are being used here to go after certain. I mean, yes, Israel would say they are high-value targets, but again, the whole issue of proportionality comes into play. And there's the reality that, when Israel wants to take out a target, quite frankly, if the trend is anything to go by, it really doesn't matter how many civilians are going to end up being killed. And just to add to what Dr. Ghassan was saying, the other challenge that is being faced here, and actually he and I were discussing this earlier today, because Dr. Ghassan is also a founding member of my charity. But the issue is that there is such a strain on the hospitals right now that doctors are also struggling with where to discharge patients to. And this was a similar problem that was faced in Gaza. Where do you discharge a patient to, especially if it's a vulnerable, injured child who needs to stay in relatively hygienic conditions when, the vast majority of them were actually injured in their own homes. So that's another aspect of all of this that, we're trying to look at. But I think, very much Gaza is on everyone's mind who's been there. Gaza is most certainly on my mind, and Gaza is most certainly on the mind of all of the Lebanese. They themselves say, we're going to become another Gaza, and the world is going to stay silent on what is happening to us, the very same way that they stayed silent or at least refused to move on getting some sort of an end to the war in Gaza. People are just going to sit back and watch us die now in Lebanon.
And Arwa, I think it's worth reminding our viewers what has been going on in Lebanon in the last few years, because the World Bank says it's one of the worst economic depressions in the world since the 19th century. The Lebanese currency, the lira, losing as much as 98% of its value. So people have no savings whatsoever. It's a state in a state of collapse with no money or resources to help the people.
Yeah, and that's pretty much what came to a head in 2019 when the economy effectively collapsed under the incompetence and corruption of the government. People lost all of their savings. And so as prices have been rising astronomically here, more and more people are being pushed below the poverty line. Add to that, then, of course, you had the horrific Beirut blast of 2020 that just sent shockwaves throughout the entire country and was absolutely devastating. And I mean, yes, the violence in Lebanon has intensified over the last week to 10 days or so, but the country has been feeling the impact of what's happening, between Hezbollah and Israel pretty much since October 8th. This is a country that has been crushed repeatedly over and over again. And I know we talk a lot about the resilience of the Lebanese people. And yes, to a certain degree, they are resilient. They are a beautiful people. They want to live, love, and laugh. But at the same time, many of them will say, look, people look at us with this idea of us being so resilient, but that doesn't mean that we're okay. That doesn't mean that we can handle everything that's coming at us. We just don't have a choice.
Maureen, let's talk about the displacement that's going on right now in the country, because the Prime Minister, Mikati, says 1 million people. And you said before, that's a fifth of the population. You said it was equivalent to a country like the UK. It would mean all of London being displaced. I mean, it is quite amazing. And this is now affecting, in recent hours, for the first time, the centre of Beirut, but southern Lebanon, the southern suburbs, eastern Lebanon, and the Bekaa Valley. I mean, it's the whole country now, is it not?
It's the whole country. I think it's the major change that we've seen since let's say last weekend. For the last 11 months, you already had displaced people because of the conflict with Israel in the south. These people tended, and it's about a bit more than 100,000 people. These people tended to stay in the south mostly. Now, with the massive increase in the number of displaced, people have to find some coping mechanism, but also only some space, basically, all across the country. So you have people who stop in the first city, Sittah, which is about halfway between the south and Beirut. And then some had more. There was also a fuel issue, simply because you were not ready to leave. So maybe your car didn't have the fuel on that Monday night. So then they made it to Beirut. And then from Beirut, some people go further north. Again, family, friends, any empty hotel's room, any shelter they can actually find. It's actually affecting the entire country, even more so with the intense strike campaigns on the Bekaa Valley, also much more intense since last weekend, a week ago, that also have pushed people from that area, Bad Bekaa, to flee towards the east.
Dr. Ghassan, I know in your medical work you are overwhelmed by the patients you're having to deal with, and you have to be practical and dispassionate. But then when you get time to reflect on what Israel is doing, what do you think? I mean, are they trying to achieve legitimate military goals, or is this again collective punishment and retribution for the actions of Hezbollah?
I mean, again, I remember thinking in October last year when I was at Shifa Hospital that this was a war on children. And again, I had that feeling the other day when we were treating a 13-year-old girl who has a blast injury to the face. Her mandible, her lower jaw was in 4 pieces. Her face was opened like a book. And I thought, this is again a war on children. When you bomb people's homes, you injure children, and you injure multiple children within the same family, and you devastate that family. And so this is all happening again. Israel is using what you can call a process of catastrophization, that it will overwhelm Lebanon like it overwhelmed Gaza by creating a humanitarian catastrophe. I remember in Gaza thinking they just want us to drown in our own blood. And again, in Lebanon, you think about the fact that already over 1,000 killed, 8,000 wounded, over 100 children killed, 41 health staff killed. Again, Israel's strategy is to create a humanitarian catastrophe and literally drown the Lebanese in their own blood.
Maureen, what do we do about the immediate problems, the problem particularly of all of these people living out in the open, in unsanitary conditions? Where do we get the resources? Where do we get tents? Where do we get aid workers? What is being done about trying to bring help to these people?
So the first thing that the government did is that they opened all the schools in Lebanon. So basically, since Monday night, you have people rocking up at the gate of schools, not prepared for that. And then people, pushing the furniture in the kids' classrooms just to fall on the ground and try to find some sleep. And then at 2 a.m., maybe another family being brought into the classroom to sleep next to your family. This situation is continuing. There are more than 800 schools, open at that point. 2/3 of them are already at full capacity. And it's not, it's very precarious. It's very basic living conditions in these schools. From a living environment. Not all these people yet have mattresses and sleeping bags or bed sheets. Of course, there is usually no showers in these schools, so the hygiene conditions is also difficult. The environment, the stress to be idle, think about the home that you left behind, is extremely tough conditions. Then you have people who still haven't found a place to live, people who've moved every other day because, today and tomorrow I stay at a friend, but then he comes back with his family, so I need to move on. Maybe I find an hotel room, but then I need to move on again. So that level of stress and displacement is still super high. As of the big strike Friday evening on Beirut, I had colleagues who had to leave in the middle of the night when Israeli was sending evacuation orders. So people are really left with whatever they can flee with. There are a lot of solidarity in the streets, but also in the emergency shelters, community around, of course, international NGOs, but even more neighbors coming up, bringing you tea and coffee and water and food. So there's that network that's kicking in, and that's fantastic to see. With the time, it's going to be difficult if nothing is done to support these networks, to have that in a medium term. So what's going to happen next week? Are you still going to show up with your coffee pot and offer that to the people displaced? So there's been the international community has come together. Lebanon, sadly, has been a country where there's been heavy humanitarian presence for the reasons you've mentioned, including the Syria refugee crisis. So we've all mobilized, trying our best to, again, provide mattresses and blankets, but also hot meals, trying to install showers, fix the latrines, the toilets in the schools. So we are still at the very basic level of service. It's a week only, but it's 1 million people in a week. So the level of resources, of capacity to be mobilized is extremely high.
Arwa, some of the pictures I saw moved me because they were from Martyrs Square, which, when I first went to Lebanon at the end of the civil war, that used to be the front line between East and West Beirut. But also I was there in 2005 when people were protesting against the Syrians, ending the Syrian military presence. And then they were protesting against the entire political elite in 2019. And now it's a makeshift camp of people. And the historical resonance, these are people who for years have been wanting something better for them and their country.
They have been wanting that for years, and they've been fighting for that, I would even argue, for decades, trying to sort of move Lebanon out of this state of constantly being subjugated to its political elite, who are highly corrupt for the most part, who are incapable of providing proper governance, and who also, frankly, have fully exploited the country, not to mention also being subjugated to all of these external powers. To add to what you're hearing, we also need to take into consideration that even though the Lebanese, are united right now in terms of wanting to help, this is also still a very deeply, bitterly divided country. There is a lot of tension right now that existed and still continues to exist between mostly the Lebanese and also the Syrian refugee community that is here. So people who fled the war in Syria came to Lebanon and had to flee again because of the bombardment that has been happening in various parts of the country, are finding themselves, struggling even more so than others in some cases. I spoke to a young woman who's actually under Inada's care. She's 18 years old. Earlier today, she was horribly burnt in an explosion in Syria that basically also killed her father. She had to walk with her 2 brothers from the south for about 2 days to find a semblance of shelter in Beirut, which is basically a semi-constructed building at this stage, and a number of other beneficiaries who are under Inada's care, because we do the sort of long-term care. So a lot of them are, in fact, Syrian children who were injured in Syria, are not just having to deal with this displacement again, but also with having, this ingrained trauma re-triggered. And on top of all of that, this sense that, Lebanon doesn't necessarily want us here and is feeling as if, we're a burden on this already, let's face it, broken system. And so there's so many layers to this, and they're just layers of pain that are compounding even more pain.
Ghassan, the worry is this is only going to get worse, in one way because, of course, Israel is still continuing this repeated bombardment, but also we saw what happened in Gaza. There is the risk of disease. We had polio in Gaza. How worried are you about the risk of disease now, given the scenes that you're seeing across Lebanon?
Absolutely. Every time I pass by a school that's been turned into an internally displaced camp, you think back to Gaza, you think back to the ratios of number of toilets per individual, number of showers per individual, You think back to people running out of their savings, and in terms of the quality of food they're able to purchase. And you think about what exists at the moment in Gaza, which is this triad of death: malnutrition, infectious disease, and injury. And so when these three meet, it means that people die of lesser wounds, they die of lesser infections, and they die of lesser levels of malnutrition. But when the three get together, that's when they are absolutely fatal. And again, we're this is about to turn into autumn, and hypothermia. It adds another layer to this invisible death. And so what you get, what you have in Gaza and what you will get here, is that death becomes like an iceberg. What you see is the pit.
Let me bring in Maureen at the end, if I can, Ghassan. What would be your message to the international community? Clearly, the fighting has to stop, but in terms of the humanitarian operation, what would you say to world leaders right now?
They need to fund the response. They need to give money to the agency responding on the ground through whatever channel they have. I think the government of Lebanon has been very clear. They also take in-kind donation because the situation is extremely dire. I think as long as more money goes to weapon selling than to humanitarian aid, the situation will remain dire.
Well, thank you very much, all three of you, for joining us today on Inside Story. Our guests were Dr. Ghassan Abu Sittah, Maureen Philippon and Arwa Damon. And thank you, too, for watching. If you missed any of the programme, it's available on demand on our phone app or at aljazeera.com. We always want to hear from you as well. Leave your thoughts on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or find us on X. Look for @AJ Inside Story. From me, James Bays, and the production team here in Doha, please stay safe. Bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.